This tale is not of people who could fly, but of warriors descending from the skies.
In pods of steel and self-government, they fall to the ground and spread managed democracy throughout the stars.
Helldivers are their name, and freedom is their cause. Hey, I'm Sprout.
And I'm Zon.
On Into the Virtual Unknown, we talk about newly released or upcoming games, share our thoughts on them, and if we played them, we'll give a recommendation whether you should or should not buy them.
Today's subject is Helldivers II, a third-person shooter where you play as a Helldiver, an elite soldier of the Super Earth Armed Forces, and you fight in the Second Galactic War.
On one front are the Terminids, swarming bugs of greatly varying size, inspired by Starship Troopers. On the other, automatons, humanoid robots with guns, almost like Walmart Terminator. Now let's talk gameplay.
As a Helldiver, you have the freedom to choose where you fight, from different planets to entire war fronts. When you decide to deploy your super destroyer to a planet, a number of operations of varying difficulty will be available to you. Depending on what difficulty you choose, the operations will have between 1 and 4 missions, and the missions will have more or less primary and secondary objectives, as well as enemies of increasing size and challenge.
If you want to survive the mission you chose, you'll need some good equipment for your Helldiver. There are 4 main things you need to choose: primary weapon, secondary weapon, grenade/utility, and armor. First up is primary weapon. As this is usually your main way of dealing with enemies, you'll want to choose it with care, depending on your preferred role and what enemies you expect to run into. Every weapon has traits, which determine how it functions. Aside from damage, fire rate, ammo, and recoil, the most important trait is arguably armor penetration. Each weapon can penetrate different levels of armor, and if you're up against an enemy with more armor than you could beat, you're screwed. Next is your secondary weapon. When you choose a secondary, it should always be something that complements your primary, and makes up for any weaknesses it may have. If you're using a primary with low armor penetration, an anti-armor secondary is a good pick. If you're using a slow, heavy primary, a quick anti-crowd secondary will do you well. Third is your grenade/utility. This one is usually up to personal preference. There are area denial flame grenades, grenades that explode on impact, and even anti-armor grenades. Give them all a try and stick with what works for you. Last is your armor. There are 2 things to focus on when choosing armor. Firstly is how light it is. This determines its speed, stamina regeneration, and damage reduction stats. Second is the passive trait. Each one provides something special, and they should be considered wisely.
Once you've chosen your Helldiver's gear, it's time to get in your Hellpod and prepare to deploy. But before you can drop to the planet to dish out managed democracy, you need to choose what stratagems you want for the mission. Stratagems come in a few varieties, each filling a different role. Be wary though, you have a limited number of stratagem slots for each mission, so don't waste them on something you won't use. First, and arguably most importantly, is the support weapon. It has its own dedicated inventory slot on your Helldiver, and is far more powerful than your other weapons. They're often rather specialized as well. Second are backpacks. Much like support weapons, they have their own dedicated slot, but backpacks are much less offensively focused. Some are support items, like the supply pack, while others are defensive items, like the shield generator. Some are even required to reload certain support weapons, although those come with the weapons themselves. Third are offensive stratagems. These are airstrikes, orbital bombardment, and the like. If it's an attack that you call down on or near a point, it's offensive. Next are defensive ones. This includes turrets, stationary shield generators, emplacement guns, and anything like that. If it doesn't move and it helps you defend, it's defensive. Finally are utility stratagems. This is kinda a catch-all term for everything else, from vehicles to EMS stun fields to smoke strikes. Beyond typology, there's something far more important about stratagems. Being rather powerful, they need to be used to complement your other gear. If your weapons have very little armor penetration, take anti-armor support weapons or offensive stratagems. If you lack crowd control, get large area attacks like the Eagle Cluster Bomb or Napalm. If all of your weapons are slow and heavy, get an EMS strike or EMS mortar to slow your enemies down. You get the idea.
On the subject of tools of mass destruction, we can only hope that you will be using them on your enemies and not your friends. That begs the question of what enemies a Helldiver commonly faces. On increasing difficulty, a Helldiver will encounter progressively beefier enemies with higher armor ratings, some of which call for a more direct approach. Each enemy, no matter the faction, has different armor ratings throughout their bodies, with their heads being their weak points most of the time. However, with a few enemies this is not the case, with examples such as the Hive Guards, tanks, cannons, and a few others depending on your armor penetration capabilities. As you can imagine, bugs are a little bit more fleshy and gooey than the hard, steel-skinned automatons. You'll definitely want a weapon with higher armor penetration on missions against the bots.
Now that you know about strategy within missions, let's move on to strategy of what missions to choose. As mentioned earlier, the Helldiver can choose where they fight, and that is their greatest asset. The Second Galactic War rages on, and the collective will of the Helldivers will be its sculptor. When you go to your war table and read attacks on planets, defenses on others, and all of that, you need to keep in mind what would ultimately serve the war effort as a whole. The last piece of strategy is unity. If the Helldivers are split between 5 worlds, none of them will be saved or attacked. Only by working together can victory be achieved.
On the topic of the Second Galactic War, let's touch on the story of it. And to be clear, I do know that the Second Galactic War wasn't officially declared until much more recently, but it's easier to refer to the entire story of Helldivers II as the Second Galactic War, so we'll be continuing to do so. In the early days, it was pretty simple. There were Terminid outbreaks on one side and automaton attacks on the other. However, after a little while of that, things began to get serious. The turning point, as I define it, was the release of the first exosuit and the deployment of Terminid Control System, also known as TCS.
After that, things ramped up. New enemies appeared, and Operation Swift Disassembly saw the automatons pushed out of the territory that they had once controlled. Then, the automaton reclamation began, and they took many systems previously under our control. Shortly after, the TCS malfunctioned, turning one planet into a super colony and threatening to do so to more. That brings us to the current time. The Helldivers recently mobilized to use a mysterious substance known as dark fluid to create a black hole in the center of the super colony and destroyed the whole planet in the process. All of that said, it'd be impossible to talk about the story of Helldivers II and not mention the satirical nature of it. Much like one of its biggest influences, Starship Troopers, the game is a satire of the overly patriotic ideas it features, primarily the heavy use of freedom, democracy, and other such phrases to justify committing horrendous acts.
With all that talk about what's inside of the game, let's delve into the out-of-game side of things. Helldivers 2 gets a significant amount of updates in a short amount of time. These updates are usually at the end of major orders, or with the additions of new warbots. This gives the devs the opportunity to sneak in a few changes here and there, which introduces bigger changes than the players thought. This usually reveals itself as clues, sneak peeks, or even brand new additions to the game, with the examples like the sudden appearance of Shriekers, flying bugs of death, gunships, flying bots of death, and factory striders, 4-legged walkers capable of producing enemies on the move. An interesting twist to keep players on their toes. As said before, the addition of war bonds is another type of update that is frequently done every month or so, adding brand new weapons, armor, capes, grenades, and even skins for weapons and vehicles. Though, with the addition of more weapons comes balance patches. With mixed reviews dividing the community, these patches are commonly viewed as universally neither good nor bad.
On to our closing remarks and last notes before we get into our recommendation.
One thing Helldivers 2 has is the effect of bringing the community together to seek a common goal. And for better or for worse, it is achieved at building the strongest community I've ever seen.
Another thing it does rather well is having the world not be static and be highly influenced by the community's actions. One of the ways that they pull this off is by having a game master, much like the GM or DM in a TTRPG like Dungeons & Dragons. The Game Master is the architect of the story to some degree, and can easily update the world on a daily basis based on what the community has been doing.
So, is it good?
In a word, yes.
In multiple, also yes. It's a game with solid gameplay, frequent updates, an enjoyable world, and a strong community.
Or to put it another way,
Join the Helldivers.
We go now from the Helldivers above to the dungeons below.
an ancient dungeon risen from the depths. Adventurers delve to find its secrets.
No one leaves its chambers alive. Will you be the first to survive?